If you haven't already guessed, our quilt this year is a row quilt. So I already talked to you last month about putting together the paper piece row, so I'm not going to cover it again in this video. And the month before, in August, I talked about putting together the snowball row, so I won't cover that one either. So our top row is the hourglass row. So we made 10 of these blocks. You're going to arrange them however you want. So this is my arrangement, I think. It could change after I start sewing. So that's the 10 of them in a row. I'm just going to sew one long row. It should finish at 30.5 inches if everything's accurate. Here's my hourglass row all stitched together. I opted to press my seams open to reduce bulk in them, and this row should be 30.5 inches long. The poinsettia blocks are 6.5 inch unfinished, so once they're sewn together, this row also will be 30.5. So there's how I have mine laid out. There is one that's really dark, so I put it in the center, and then my two lighter ones and then my other two darker ones, but you can put it together any way you want. It's just sew the edges together again. This is my finished poinsettia row. Again, I pressed my seams open, and like I already said, it should be 30.5 inches wide. This row combines the sawtooth star with the 9 patch with corners blocks that we made months ago. So again, you can arrange them how you want, but it's supposed to go star, 9 patch with corners, star, 9 patch with corners, star. So here's my layout. And these are 6.5 unfinished blocks. So my row, again, will finish at 30.5 inches wide. I'm just sewing them together. And really, these points right here, this should be running into the seam. It's not going to be real easy to match, but that would be your matching points. This is the sawtooth star and the 9 patch with corners row sewn together. I pressed the seams open. That way there wasn't bulk going to any one corner. Again, 30.5 inches wide. I didn't have you trim down the snowman row when we made it. So if you did and followed the pattern, that's great, but if you didn't, this needs to be trimmed down to 8.5 high by 30.5 wide. Now, I don't know about you, but I get a little bit paranoid when I have to go trim something that I did by hand, so like hand applique or hand embroidery, because there's so much time in it. So one of the things I do is I take freezer paper and mark out how big it's supposed to be. So this piece is 8.5 by 30.5. Then I center it over my piece, and you can see through it well enough to make sure that everything's centered. And do remember, you will be stitching 1/4 inch from the edge, and then I iron it in place. And that just gives me a visual guide when I go to trim this. Now, my fringe goes beyond the 30.5, so what I'm going to do is fold it back when I iron the freezer paper on top of this to hold it out of the way, because I don't mind if it hangs over the seam once it's sewn in there. I don't want to cut it off at a raggedy edge either. So I'm going to go ahead and iron this on, and then I'll come back and talk about trimming it with the freezer paper on there. I pressed my freezer paper in place, and it doesn't have to be on there really, really well. You just want it well enough that it stays while you're trimming. Now, even though I have the freezer paper on there, I'm still going to use a ruler when I trim, just because you can slice off bits of the paper and change your size. The other thing I wanted to mention is if you're looking through your freezer paper and you can see that you can see through it, and you can see that when you do a 1/4 inch seam somewhere, you're going to slice off like the bottom of the snowman or the top, the hat in the snowman, you could make this row just a little bit taller. If you wanted to make it up to 1/2 inch taller, it would be fine, but you still want it to be 30.5 inches wide. So I have a ruler that's big enough that it will actually cross my whole row. If you don't, you can use a straight one and trim your edge. So I'm going to line up, my 8.5 inch mark along the long edge of my freezer paper here on the bottom. I'm going to slide it over, and I'm going to get ready to trim off this edge. And it's a little bit harder with this tripod in the way, but to cut. And I'm still going to use the ruler. I'm leaving my 8.5 inch mark along the bottom edge, and I'm going to cut across the top. Because really the freezer paper is just giving me a visual guide so that I don't accidentally cut this too small. So I'll move down, line up again at the 8.5 inch mark along my bottom edge. Trim. And then all the way down to the other end. Because of how I'm set up, I really can't see that other end, so I'm not going to try to cut down the side. I'm going to go ahead and rotate. I'm going to line up one of my straight lines along that edge that was my top now. I move it down and slice off the end. And now I'm just going to work back down, lining up my 8.5 inch mark with the edge that I just cut, the long edge, and finish trimming this down. Once I have finished trimming my row using my freezer paper as a guide, it's not my exact measurements, I'm still using my ruler, then I'm just going to peel my freezer paper off, and it doesn't affect my block at all. If you were doing several blocks that were the same size in a quilt, you could reuse that freezer paper. So now my applique block is trimmed down and ready to go in the quilt. This month in your kit you have two pieces of fabric. You have the red, which is going to be our outside borders, and the black, which is going to be inside borders or sashing, however you want to look at it. They are both long pieces, cut lengthwise so that you'll have more stable fabric for your sashing and for your borders. Your black piece is about 14 inches wide and it's about 2 yards long. We're going to fold it with the long side together. So you may have selvage on yours or you may not, depending on where it was cut out of the fabric. So I folded it in half once with the long straight edge together, and then I'm going to fold it in half again, still with the long straight edge together. And I want to line it up as well as I can. You do not have a ton of extra fabric in either of these pieces, so be careful. Now the directions tell you to cut a 5-inch strip and set it aside for your long narrow borders. I'm not going to have you do that. We're just going to cut 2-inch wide strips. We're going to need six 2-inch wide strips. So just disregard what the pattern says. We're going to cut them all out of the lengthwise grain of the fabric. So I've got this lined up as best I can, keeping it as straight as I possibly can, and I'm ready to start cutting my 2-inch strips. So the first thing I'm going to do is get a clean edge so that it's nice and straight. I'm going to cut off as little as I can to get rid of the selvage. I have a little bit extra in the black, less in the red, but we're going to be cutting same way, just different measurements between the black and the red. Let's check. I'm going to line up any mark along my fold, and this is 4 layers of fabric now. I'm going to scoot it in so that I'm cutting out the selvage off completely, and I'm going to cut. Okay, so I said I need 6 2-inch wide strips. This happens to be an 8-inch wide ruler. So I'm going to line up my 8-inch mark with that long straight edge that I just cut. Actually, this is going to work easier if you turn it around. I can't do it this direction with it that wide. Turn it very carefully so those edges stay together. If you only have a 6 or 6.5 inch wide ruler, then line up your 6-inch mark. But since I have an 8-inch wide, I'm going to line up my 8-inch mark because I'm cutting 2-inch strips, so anything that's divisible by 2. And I'm going to cut. And I don't want this slipping around, so I'm going to move my hand to keep everything steady. Okay, so that was my first cut. I'm going to move back to my 6-inch mark. I'm still keeping lines. Well, the fold's up at the top now. So I'm keeping a line along that fold to just keep everything straight. So if I don't, I'll get zigzags. Hopefully I won't. I'm going to cut at the 6-inch mark. Going to back it up to the 4-inch mark. And cut. And then to the 2-inch mark. And cut. I'll get those out of the way. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I didn't cut all the way through, so that's not good. Catch it. And I just want to make sure these edges are lined up even, especially since I just moved it. I would have rather have not moved it. I could take a sliver off of that. I'm not going to. I need 2 more strips, so I'm going to line up at my 4-inch mark. And again, I'm checking up here to try to keep everything straight. And cut. This piece is just extra or scrap. Going to back off to the 2-inch mark and cut. And I'm going to take 2 of these 2-inch strips and set them aside so that they are my long vertical strips. I don't want to cut them down. I set aside 2 of my full-length strips, and the other 4 I'm going to cut in half just so they're easier to use. So I end up with 8 shorter strips. From these strips I need to cut them all down to 30.5 inches. So to do that, I'm going to fold them in half. Actually, I want to go this way. Sorry. Line up my straight edges. And this one has a little bit of selvage still on it. It won't matter. It's going to be in the seam. But I want to make sure they're lined up straight. Half of 30.5 is 15.25. So I'm going to take my ruler. Oh, that's in the camera. And I'm going to put my 15.25 mark on my fold that's on the short end. I'm going to line up lines with the long edges to keep everything straight. So 30.5, half of that is 15.25, so I have my 15.25 here. I'm lined up, and I'm going to go to the other end and cut off my excess. So I need 8 of these that are 2 inches wide by 30.5. The sashing strips go between each row in the quilt, plus at the top and bottom. Now this is the layout that's in the pattern. But just because that's what's in the pattern doesn't mean you have to leave the rows in this order. You're welcome to mix them up any way you want. With that said, I'm going to rearrange mine this way. So what I did was swap the snowman row and the paper piece row. And my thought process in that is the background on the snowman is darker, so with it at the top of the quilt, it's visually heavier because of the darker fabric, and it makes the quilt look top heavy to me. Doesn't mean you can't put it there if that's where you like it better. Plus, with my buildings at the top, if you're thinking about like a landscape, they would be in the background. The snowmen would be more in the front. So this is how I'm going to sew it together. You can do it any way you want. Now, when I go to sew this together, what I'm going to do is just sew a strip to the bottom of each row. That's the first thing I'm going to do, and then I will start combining those. As I go, I will be pressing my seams toward the black sashing strips. I didn't say before, but I divided each of the black sashing strips in half and marked the center, and then I marked the center of each row too, and then distributed if there was any difference between. Mine were pretty close. So now I'm ready to add my strips, my vertical strips. I would recommend that you measure in 3 places. So somewhere near the edge, which is where I have the measuring tape now, and then the other edge, and also in the center. And you can either take the smallest of those 3 measurements, or you can average them. Mine's coming out at about 52 3/8, so that's what I'm going to be cutting my strips at. And I'm going to cut the same way as I did the others. I'll fold it in half, and because mine's 52 3/8, that's 26 and about 3/16. So I will put my ruler between the 1/8 mark and the 1/4 mark when I go to cut, and it'll be on the fold. But you need to measure yours and see if it comes out right. So if you happen to add any height to your row with the snowmen, that's going to make a difference. And your seam allowances, how big they were, are also going to make a difference. So you're going to take 3 measurements, either take the shortest one or average them, and then cut your vertical strips that length. Both sides are going to be the same though. You're not going to measure one side and say, oh, well, it's a 1/2 inch longer, and measure, then do the other side. We want to keep them the same length so that it keeps the quilt square. I've stitched my vertical sashing on and pressed out toward the black sashing. Now I'm ready to add my last borders, and the first ones we're going to be adding are the top and the bottom. So again, I'm going to take the measurement of the quilt from side to side in at least 3 places. I did it close to the bottom, not right along the edge of the bottom, close to the top, and then through the middle. Whatever measurement you get, that's how long you're going to cut 2 border pieces. Mine came out to 33 1/2 is the measurement I'm going with, but you want to make sure yours matches whatever measurement you get on your quilt. For outside borders, we have a long section of red snowflake fabric. I'm going to fold it with the long sides together, and everybody should have a selvage on their fabric this time. So I've matched my selvage all the way up, fold it in half once, and then I'm going to fold it in half again to make it quarters. And I want to make sure that that's as even as I can possibly get it. And once I'm happy with it, then I'm going to clean cut one long edge. And I'm going to cut my selvage off. You have 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches more than what you need on here. You don't have a lot, so go sparingly. I do want to cut the selvage off completely, so I'm lining up a line. No, can't see it. I'm lining up a line on my ruler with the folded edge. And then I'm going to cut that selvage off. If you're working somewhere where you can walk around, it would be better than what I'm doing, but I'm going to be turning my piece of fabric. You could do it on a mat that you could turn as well. That would be better than what I'm doing. And I need to cut 4 5-inch wide strips from this fabric. I don't have a ruler that's wide enough to go 10, so I'm just going to line up my 5-inch strip with the long edge that I just cut, and it'll keep it straighter if you line up a line with your folded edge and cut. And we're just going to repeat that 4 times. So I'm going to move this one out of the way, go to the next one, line up my 5-inch mark with the long edge, lines up on the fold, and cut. And I will finish cutting the rest of them off camera, but you're just going to get 4 lengthwise strips of fabric for your borders. Remember, my measurement for the width on my quilt was 33 1/2. So half of that is 16 3/4. So I have my 16 3/4 mark lined up on the fold. I have any long line lined up on my long straight edges. And when I'm satisfied that I'm as accurate as I can be, then I'm going to cut off on the other end. I did not fold this one exactly in half. I folded it as close to the 16 3/4 as I could, and then I have a long piece left over that I can use for something else. So I need 2 of these cut for my top and bottom border. I stitched on my top and my bottom border and pressed out toward the border, and now I'm ready to cut my last 2 side borders. Again, I'm taking a measurement close to the edge on each side and up through the middle. And mine, I got about 61 3/8, but make sure you check your own measurements because it could be different than from what mine is. So I will go ahead and cut my strips down to that size. I will add them to both sides. Now, once I get this long, I divide the quilt into quarters as well as the border piece and match those up so that if there's anything to be eased in, then it gets fit in between those 4 spots. My finished quilt top came out to 42.5 inches wide by 61.5 inches long. The pattern calls for 1 3/4 yards of backing, so the measurements on that would be 63 inches long for 1 3/4, which is only 1.5 inches longer than my quilt top. And then the width of fabric can be anywhere from 42 to 44, so you either may not have enough or you might only have about 1/2 inch extra. So I would suggest instead, if you want just one seam, that you get 2 2/3 yards and then put a horizontal, cut that in half and put a horizontal seam in it. If you don't want to get that much, you could get the 1 3/4 and then you can frame it out with something else. It's just, if you get just the amount the pattern says and you're sending it to somebody else to quilt it, it is not big enough. Here's the quilt now that it is quilted and bound. I did custom quilting, so everything's different throughout the whole quilt, but it would look equally good with a snowflake pantograph over it, so you see a snowstorm going on. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned a lot. The next First Thursday mystery won't start until at least February.